Summer, 1944, Camp Swift, Texas. The noon sun hangs high above the wire. Inside the mess hall, ceiling fans hum over rows of tables packed with German prisoners of war. Men who just months ago fought in Tunisia and Normandy. Their uniforms are faded, their faces lean from years of rationing. Today's lunch looks strange to them. Real bread, soft, white, warm. Thick slices of roast beef, butter, and coffee that smells too rich to be real. They eat in silence, eyes darting toward the American cooks at the counter. Then comes something entirely new. A soldier wheels out a metal tub, rimmed with frost. The Americans scoop the pale mixture into tin bowls, smooth, cold, and sweet-smelling. The prisoners glance at each other. One tastes first, then another. The texture shocks them. Soft, frozen, sweet, beyond memory. For a moment, no one speaks. One man sets down his spoon, shaking his head in disbelief. Ice cream. In a prisoner camp, they had expected punishment. Instead, they found the flavor of America. Comfort, abundance, and something that felt dangerously close to kindness. When the first groups of German prisoners arrived in the United States in 1942, they had no idea where they were being taken. Captured in the deserts of North Africa, many had surrendered to British or American forces during Operation Torch and the Tunisian campaign. Others would come later, from the skies over Europe or the hedgerows of Normandy. Most had never seen America, and few imagined they would spend the rest of the war behind its fences. By the end of 1945, the U.S. would hold nearly 425,000 German POWs across more than 500 camps spread over 46 states. The largest populations settled in the Midwest and South, in quiet towns of Texas, Iowa, Nebraska, Georgia, and Kansas, where farmland and rail lines made logistics easy. They were transported under the strict terms of the 1929 Geneva Convention, which required humane treatment, food, shelter, medical care, and the right to correspond with family. The U.S. military took those obligations seriously. Washington wanted to demonstrate moral contrast to the Axis powers, and it also hoped that by treating Germans well, American POWs held in Europe might receive the same. The process was meticulous. Captured soldiers were first shipped to transit centers in North Africa or Britain, where they were interrogated, deloused, and medically examined. Then they boarded Liberty ships under guard for the Atlantic voyage, a journey of 2 to 3 weeks. They slept in converted cargo holds, ate American Army rations, and passed the time with cigarettes and chess pieces carved from bread. When they disembarked at ports like Norfolk, New York, or New Orleans, they stepped into another world entirely. Instead of barbed wire pens and punishment, they found order, clean barracks, showers, clothing, and regular meals served by kitchen staff who followed the same standards used for American troops. Their disbelief began with the food. At home, in the final years of the war, Germany's ration system was collapsing. Bombing raids had shattered transport lines, farmland lay untended, and civilians endured scarcity. Soldiers at the front often lived on dry bread, watery soup, and ersatz coffee made from roasted barley. But in America, even in Pointe, captivity, there was abundance. Every U.S. Army installation had access to a quartermaster corps supply chain that stretched from coast to coast. Food was standardized, transported in refrigerated rail cars, and stored in insulated warehouses. POW camps were no exception. Each man received a daily ration comparable to that of an American soldier, around 3,500 calories, including meat, vegetables, fruit, milk, sugar, and coffee. Bread was white and plentiful. Butter and jam were regular features. And then there were desserts, puddings, pies, and, on occasion, ice cream. The contrast was staggering. Letters home, censored but allowed under Geneva rules, carried glimpses of the shock. One prisoner wrote, They feed us like kings. Even the guards eat the same as we do. Another simply said, "We have bread, real bread. And sometimes there is ice cream." Such details, though small, captured the cultural collision unfolding behind the fences. The German soldiers had expected vengeance. They found civility. They had expected hunger. They found variety. Even the guards were surprised. Young American soldiers, some barely out of high school, watched the former enemy react with childlike awe at things they had long taken for granted. But none of it was accidental. The U.S. government understood that food could be both a moral statement and a strategic tool. In 1942, the War Department issued strict regulations. All prisoners were to receive the same base rations as American troops, with adjustments for nationality and custom only when necessary. Behind the policy was a deeper philosophy, that democracy, even in war, did not fear generosity, and so, across the country, the system worked. Trains delivered flour, meat, and milk to depots. Trucks carried supplies to branch camps. American cooks followed printed menus issued by the Quartermaster General. When refrigeration was available, they even made ice cream, churned in large vats or purchased from local dairies, served in metal bowls to men who had once been sworn to destroy the nation feeding them. To the Germans, it was unimaginable. To the Americans, it was simply routine. The prisoners' new world stretched across the quiet heart of America. Endless plains, fields of corn and wheat, and skies so wide that some POWs said it felt like the sea. Most camps were built on existing military bases or in rural areas where local farms needed labor. Rows of long wooden barracks surrounded by fences and guard towers became a common sight across the Midwest. Each facility housed anywhere from 300 to 3,000 men, depending on its purpose. The routine was military but humane. Every morning began with roll call, followed by breakfast served from field kitchens or permanent mess halls. Work details filled the day, tending crops, cutting timber, repairing roads, or processing food in canneries and warehouses. In exchange, prisoners received small allowances, usually 80 cents a day, paid in canteen coupons instead of cash. Those coupons became the gateway to one of the POW system's most curious features: the camp canteen. Inside every large camp, a small building stocked goods that mirrored a miniature American store. There were writing supplies, soap, cigarettes, soft drinks, chocolate bars, and, most surprising of all, ice cream. The ice cream came from local dairies or was made on-site in camp kitchens. In 1944, U.S. dairy production was so vast that the Army had ample access to milk, cream, and sugar, ingredients rationed or unavailable in most of Europe. Cold storage units and portable freezers, once built for troop ships and field hospitals, made frozen desserts a regular menu item even in remote regions. The first time German POWs saw it, they didn't understand. In Germany, only the wealthy or city dwellers had tasted ice cream before the war. To men raised on black bread and cabbage, the idea that a frozen sweet could appear in a prison camp felt absurd. Yet, there it was, scooped into tin bowls, handed out on Sundays or holidays. For American cooks, ice cream wasn't luxury. It was morale. U.S. soldiers had grown up in a country where dairy was part of daily life, where every town had a soda fountain. The quartermaster menus reflected that culture. Recipes for chocolate pudding, fruit gelatin, and ice cream. Vanilla appeared in the official Army Technical Manual, TM-10-4112. The Army Cook, issued in 1942. When POWs entered the same food chain, they received the same benefits, albeit in smaller portions. Reports from the International Committee of the Red Cross, which inspected American camps throughout the war, frequently commented on the quality and abundance of food. A 1944 inspection in Texas noted, "The nutritional standard is equal to that of the American Army. Bread, meat, vegetables, milk, and dessert are served regularly. The prisoners appear in good health and morale. Those words were not propaganda. They were policy. The War Department understood that fair treatment of POWs was not only humane, but practical. Well-fed prisoners worked better, cooperated more, and caused fewer security problems. Hunger and cruelty bred revolt. Decency bred discipline, and so the system thrived. To the prisoners, however, the experience was deeply disorienting. Many had been told by Nazi propaganda that Americans were decadent, racially impure, and economically weak. They expected cruelty or starvation. Instead, they were confronted by a society so wealthy that even its enemy ate better in captivity than many civilians did in wartime Germany. That realization spread quickly through letters home. Though heavily censored, many messages carried coded hints, mentions of excellent food, ample milk, or special cold desserts. For their families reading back in bombed-out cities, those lines were nearly incomprehensible. The ice cream itself became symbolic. A small, cold miracle that embodied everything America seemed to represent. Abundance, efficiency, comfort, and a touch of extravagance. In camp life, it was never taken for granted. On hot summer days, men lined up with quiet anticipation. On holidays, when officers organized concerts or soccer matches, the dessert marked celebration. Even guards joined in, laughing as they served their former enemies something neither side would forget. By late 1944, the routine had become familiar. German soldiers who had once fought across Africa or France now worked the soil of Nebraska and Texas, drove tractors, or repaired farm equipment. They learned English, traded recipes, and sent pay coupons home to families they might never see again. And every so often, on a Sunday afternoon or after a long day in the fields, they lined up for ice cream. To the Americans, it was a small gesture. To the prisoners, it was proof that the war, at least in this place, had lost some of its cruelty. When the first German prisoners settled into their new lives behind American fences, it wasn't the guards or the work that surprised them most. It was the kindness. They expected interrogation, deprivation, and humiliation. Instead, they found themselves offered cigarettes, music, books, and food of a quality far beyond what they had known in years. One POW, writing from Camp Aliceville, Alabama, recalled his astonishment. "We thought America would treat us harshly, but they gave us butter on our bread, meat every day, and even milk." It was hard to believe. The food became the center of daily life, a tangible symbol of their strange new reality. Meals arrived on time, hot and filling. The cooks didn't shout, the guards didn't sneer, and every so often, something appeared on their trays that seemed impossible. Fruit, chocolate, and, on rare, almost festive occasions, ice cream. The prisoners fell silent when it was served. For men who had marched across deserts, slept in bombed ruins, and eaten little but tinned meat and dry bread, the frozen sweetness was both alien and moving. It was, in its quiet way, a reminder of the world that war had destroyed, a taste of the ordinary peace they had lost. For many, that moment planted a seed. If their captors could be so civilized, perhaps the world was not as their leaders had claimed. The technological angle, the cold chain of war chatiyu. Simple fact that ice cream could exist in a POW camp was itself a marvel of wartime engineering. In 1943, America's Quartermaster Corps managed one of the most advanced supply systems on Earth. Thousands of refrigerated rail cars, reefers, rolled daily from the Midwest to ports, air bases, and camps. Ice plants operated around the clock, producing tons of block ice to preserve meat, dairy, and produce across thousands of miles. Even in rural Texas, Nebraska, or Alabama, the infrastructure was staggering. Cold storage warehouses hummed beside rail sidings, Diesel generators powered freezers in field kitchens. Local dairies contracted to military buyers delivered milk, cream, and butter by the gallon. The result was a logistical miracle, one so efficient that even remote prisoner compounds received fresh supplies. When refrigeration units arrived, ice cream wasn't far behind. The dessert itself was often made by army cooks using standardized recipes from the quartermaster manual. Each serving required milk, sugar, powdered eggs, vanilla extract, and dry ice or mechanical churns. Some camps improvised with ice and salt churns. Others purchased commercial ice cream from local plants through canteen funds. The ability to deliver such luxuries to men behind barbed wire spoke volumes about the scale of American industry. While Europe struggled to feed civilians, America could feed its enemies, cold desserts included. To German engineers and officers among the prisoners, this was nothing short of shocking. They realized that they weren't just confronting a powerful army. They were confronting an industrial civilization whose organization could turn even comfort into strategy. The logistic and fix sent to Saturtweiten Sound. Psychological angle. Food as policy. Behind the generosity lay deliberate policy. The War Department understood that how it treated prisoners would shape morale, cooperation, and the nation's reputation. Feeding POWs well wasn't weakness. It was calculation. A man who ate well worked harder, caused fewer problems, and was easier to debrief. The Geneva Convention demanded equal treatment, but America went further, giving prisoners food equal to or better than its own troops when surpluses allowed. Quartermaster manuals directed mess officers to maintain balance and variety consistent with national standards. That meant not just sustenance, but familiarity. Bread, coffee, potatoes, fruit, and desserts. This policy paid dividends. American guards reported that good meals diffused resentment. Work crews volunteered more readily. Some POWs even began singing during labor. German folk songs mixing with American country tunes drifting over the fields. When ice cream appeared, morale spiked noticeably. One camp commandant wrote in his log, "Prisoners displayed visible enthusiasm. Conduct and productivity notably improved after dessert served at Sunday meal." For the Americans, it was a small logistical note. For the prisoners, it was a quiet act of disarmament, a sweet, melting reminder that this strange land waged war without hatred. The human and logistical threads intertwined perfectly. In every camp, the same scene repeated. Men who had been taught to despise America stood in line, spoons in hand, tasting not punishment, but plenty. And what began as disbelief soon became reflection. The realization that civilization could express its power not through cruelty, but through comfort. For years, Nazi propaganda had painted America as a decaying, materialistic society, soft, decadent, and unfit for war. To many captured soldiers, the first glimpse of the United States shattered that illusion instantly. They expected poverty. They found abundance. They expected cruelty. They found civility. And the ice cream, the small, ridiculous symbol of comfort, became proof that everything they'd been told was wrong. A Luftwaffe mechanic imprisoned in Camp McCoy, Wisconsin, wrote later in his memoir, "They gave us more than we could eat." The guards were polite, and one day there was ice cream. We could not understand how a nation could fight such a great war and still have sugar for its prisoners. The disbelief turned to quiet respect. Prisoners began asking guards about America, its factories, its farms, its women, its freedom. Some requested English lessons, others joined camp schools, where American officers taught mathematics, carpentry, or civics. The U.S. didn't need to boast about democracy. It demonstrated it. 3 meals a day, no shouting, and the occasional frozen dessert in summer. To the Germans, it was both humiliating and enlightening. They had lost the material war before the fighting had even ended. The moral angle. The power of example to American officials. Good treatment of prisoners wasn't just about rules, it was about values. The Geneva Convention mandated humane care, but the War Department saw it as an opportunity to showcase the moral difference between fascism and democracy. If Nazi Germany had used fear to command obedience, the United States would use fairness to command respect. Feeding the enemy well was a moral statement wrapped in logistics. It told the world that America's strength lay not only in its weapons, but in its decency. There was also a psychological dimension. Officials hoped that well-treated POWs would carry their experiences back to Germany, spreading the idea that American democracy was not an enemy of the German people, only of Nazism. It worked. After the war, many returning POWs spoke fondly of their time in U.S. camps, describing them as places of order, comfort, and even friendship. Some later immigrated back to America, unable to forget the country that had shown them humanity amid chaos. One former prisoner said simply, "I came to destroy America. I left wanting to build it." The cultural angle. Ice cream and American identity. To understand why ice cream struck such a deep chord, one must understand what it represented. In wartime America, ice cream was more than food. It was morale in a bowl. Factories churned out millions of gallons not only for civilians, but for the armed forces. The Navy even built floating ice cream factories aboard converted barges, delivering desserts to sailors in the Pacific. It symbolized normalcy, the idea that even in the midst of global war, the simple pleasures of home could survive. For American soldiers, it was a taste of childhood. For German POWs, it was a revelation. The dessert carried cultural weight, optimism, industrial strength, and the ability to turn luxury into mass production. It was a small proof that America's wealth wasn't built on conquest, but on creation. When prisoners were served ice cream, they weren't just eating food. They were tasting the essence of the society that had defeated them. Industrious, inventive, and endlessly confident. In camp folklore, the memory persisted. Prisoners joked that the Americans must have factories the size of cities to feed everyone so well. They weren't far off. By 1944, the United States was producing nearly 900 million gallons of ice cream annually. Enough to give every soldier and civilian multiple servings per week. To Tuin, a German whose homeland rationed butter and powdered eggs, this level of abundance bordered on the surreal. The philosophical angle. Civilization in captivity. Every empire boasts of power, but few prove it through restraint. The United States, in its POW camps, demonstrated that real strength needed no cruelty. The barbed wire stayed, the guards, the discipline, the rules. Yet inside, there was a functioning microcosm of order and civility, powered by something deeper than fear. The belief that even an enemy could be treated as a man. For those who lived through it, that belief became the quiet miracle of their captivity. And for many, the first taste of ice cream became the symbol of it. By 1944, America's POW system had achieved what no propaganda could. It had changed hearts through decency. And as the war neared its climax, that same spirit, industrial power guided by principle, would soon decide the fate of nations. Summer, 1944. Camp Hearn, Texas. The war in Europe rages far away, but here, in the American heartland, the air smells of dust and milk. Fields stretch to the horizon, and the wind rattles the tin roofs of the barracks. Inside the wire, life has settled into rhythm. At dawn, the prisoners wake to reveille. By day, they work the fields, picking cotton, harvesting corn, or repairing fences. By evening, they march back under a setting sun that turns the sky gold and red. They eat, write letters, play chess, and listen to the faint crackle of jazz from the guards' radios. But this Sunday is different. The mess hall has been decorated with bunting. Red, white, and blue streamers cut from old newspapers. The Americans have declared it a victory dinner in celebration of Allied gains in Europe. For the prisoners, it means an unusually large meal. Roast beef, potatoes, green beans, fresh bread, and something whispered about all day. Ice cream. The Germans laugh when they hear it. Ice cream? In a camp? Impossible. That afternoon, the heat is fierce. The line outside the mess stretches long. Inside, the kitchen is chaos. American cooks sweating under white aprons, stirring vats of food while fans spin slowly overhead. Then, from the back, two men wheel in a pair of metal tubs packed with frost. The air smells faintly of vanilla and cream. One of the cooks, an older sergeant from Ohio, grins at the line of prisoners and says, "Go easy. It's the real thing." The first prisoner steps forward, bowl trembling in his hand. A scoop drops, pale, cold, perfect. He hesitates, then tastes. The chill hits his tongue like electricity. The sweetness follows, rich, unfamiliar, almost overwhelming. He looks up, startled. Around him, others have begun to eat. Then, without a word, a silence spreads down the line. That quiet, reverent silence of men encountering something they can't quite name. It's not hunger anymore. It's astonishment. For a moment, the war disappears. The guards lean against the counters, smiling. A German officer, once proud and rigid, lowers his head as if in prayer. Another prisoner laughs suddenly, a short, incredulous laugh, and says softly, "So, this is what they eat in America." Later, one of the camp cooks would recall, "They didn't speak much that day, just ate slow. You could tell it hit them, not the food, but the idea of it, that we'd give it to them." In that small hall, under the hum of ceiling fans, the lines between enemy and host blurred, not erased, but softened. For the first time, the Germans felt something they hadn't known in years. Normalcy, comfort, and the faint, dangerous pull of gratitude. The U.S. Army had not intended to make a moral gesture, only to follow procedure, to serve a standard menu. Yet the result was profound. A bowl of ice cream became an act of quiet diplomacy. The simplest possible proof that American abundance was real, and that it could afford to be kind. That night, the camp orchestra played. A few Americans stood by the fence listening to the violins drift through the dusk. The Germans sang softly afterward, not military songs, but old folk tunes from home. Later, in the barracks, the talk turned not to Hitler or the war, but to food, to milk, sugar, the impossibility of cold sweetness in a land at peace. One prisoner said quietly, "At home, my mother stands in line for bread, and here they feed us like sons," another replied, almost bitterly. "Maybe that's why they will win." The reports reflected it too. American officers noticed a change. Discipline improved, tensions eased, and work details volunteered more willingly. Interrogators reported that POWs spoke more openly about their doubts in the Reich. In the words of one Army intelligence summary, the prisoners express growing curiosity and respect for American conditions. They are bewildered by the nation's capacity for plenty in war. It wasn't ideology that won their minds that day. It was ice, sugar, and milk. Symbols of a system that could fight total war without losing its humanity. By the end of the summer, letters sent home were filled with quiet astonishment. The censorship officers read them carefully. Lines like, "We are treated well. We even have ice cream." Those words, simple and almost naive, would travel farther than any weapon. They carried the whisper of a different kind of victory. One fought not with bullets, but with civility. What began as an ordinary Sunday meal had become a turning point in perception. A moment when the enemy began to see America not as a brutal conqueror, but as a civilization built on strength and grace combined. And that realization would echo long after the bowls were emptied. Autumn 1944. The ripple effect weeks passed after the ice cream day, but its memory lingered like a quiet warmth through the camp. The prisoners continued their routines, fieldwork, classes, roll call, but something invisible had changed. Conversation softened. Eyes that once narrowed at American guards now met them with faint smiles. It wasn't surrender, it was realization. Many of these men had spent years immersed in propaganda, told that America was chaotic, weak, and ruled by greed. They expected vengeance, starvation, humiliation. Yet behind the barbed wire, they were met not with punishment, but with organization and routine, and meals that would have made their families in Hamburg or Cologne weep with envy. That small bowl of ice cream had become a symbol of something vast, a country so confident in its strength that it could treat its enemies as men across the U.S. Reports echoed the same pattern. In Camp Aliceville, Alabama, prisoners wrote home about concerts and books, but always mentioned the food. In Camp Concordia, Kansas, they worked farm fields beside local civilians, returning each night to warm showers and well-fed stomachs. In Camp Crossville, Tennessee, one inspector noted that prisoners gained an average of 10 pounds within 3 months. To them, the American war machine was not just deadly, it was incomprehensibly efficient. How could a nation fighting across 2 oceans still have cream, sugar, and cold storage enough to feed its captives? For the Germans, it felt like a moral paradox. For the Americans, it was simply logistics. The Quartermaster Corps did not distinguish between feeding soldiers and prisoners. Both were part of the same supply chain. Flour milled in Kansas, milk bottled in Wisconsin, sugar refined in Louisiana, all moved through rail networks that functioned like arteries. Even the spoons the prisoners used were standardized Army issue, stamped U.S. in neat letters. The Germans couldn't help noticing. Order, precision, and efficiency, the very values they'd been taught to admire, were being practiced by their enemy. That winter, the contrast deepened. In Germany, the food crisis reached breaking point. Cities lay in ruins. Civilians survived on ration cards measured in ounces, not pounds. Meat was scarce, butter almost non-existent, and sugar rationed to a few spoonfuls per week. Prisoners in America began receiving letters from home describing hunger and cold. Some wept when they read them. Others hid the news, ashamed to admit that they, the defeated, were living better than their families. One diary entry found after the war read, "Today we had ice cream again. It is difficult to write this, knowing that my mother has not seen milk in months." The guilt was real, but so was the awakening. The same men who had once sworn loyalty to the Reich now began questioning everything they'd believed about the enemy. In their minds, the ice cream became more than a dessert. It was a symbol of America's moral and material superiority. Even American officers noticed the transformation. An internal report from 1945 observed, "Hostility among German POWs decreases in direct proportion to contact with civilian generosity and camp privileges. The better they are treated, the less they believe Nazi propaganda." In short, kindness had become a weapon, one far subtler and more effective than any bullet. That strategy extended beyond the camps. U.S. officials knew that every repatriated prisoner would carry stories. Home, stories of decent treatment, plentiful food, and the strange miracle of cold dessert in captivity. When the war ended, those stories would become the first cracks in the myth of Nazi supremacy. In some camps, guards and prisoners began sharing food openly. An American private from Iowa later recalled, "We'd sit on the steps, them and us, both eating ice cream when it came around. You could forget for a moment who was supposed to be the enemy. That moment, brief, human, and ordinary, was the quiet climax of a much larger struggle. America was proving, not through words but through example, that civilization could be powerful without being cruel. It could fight total war and still preserve its moral core." In the soft light of a Sunday afternoon, over a melting bowl of ice cream, that truth had become undeniable. When victory finally came in 1945, the German POWs knew something their leaders did not. They had seen the true face of their enemy. Not the monstrous caricature painted by propaganda, but a nation of structure, industry, and quiet compassion. A civilization that wielded generosity as confidently as it wielded steel. For many, that realization would outlast the war itself. Some would carry it home and rebuild new lives from it. Others would never forget that the first time they truly doubted their old beliefs was not in a battle, but in a mess hall, with a spoon of melting ice cream. Spring 1945. America's camps, in transition by the time Germany capitulated in May 1945, the POW system in the United States had reached its peak. An empire of orders spread across quiet farmlands and forgotten rail junctions. More than 425,000 German prisoners were still in custody, scattered across over 500 main and branch camps. For the men behind the fences, the end of the war brought confusion, relief, and unease. They listened to the radio in silence as the news of Hitler's death spread through the compounds. Some wept quietly. Others simply stared into space, uncertain what came next. In many camps, the American guards, some of whom had watched these men for years, shook hands through the wire. "It's over," one said simply. But for the prisoners, the experience of America had left an indelible mark. They had arrived expecting vengeance and degradation. They would leave with a strange gratitude, a sense that the country which had defeated them had also restored their humanity. And through all their recollections, one detail appeared again and again: the food, the bread, the coffee, and most of all, the ice cream. When repatriation began in late 1945, trains carried prisoners eastward to ports like Newport News, Virginia, and New York Harbor, where ships waited to return them to Europe. Each departing convoy carried men heavier, healthier, and more contemplative than when they'd arrived. Red Cross records confirmed it. The average German POW in the United States gained between 10 and 15 pounds during captivity. Malnutrition, disease, and mistreatment, so common in other theaters, were nearly non-existent here. On the docks, American soldiers handed out small comfort packages, cigarettes, chocolate, fruit, sometimes even a scoop of ice cream from portable coolers. The gesture, simple and wordless, encapsulated everything the war's victors wanted the world to see: power without cruelty, victory without hatred. Many prisoners waved as the ships pulled away. Some sang. Others watched in silence as the skyline of America faded over the horizon. A nation that had conquered them not only with arms, but with decency. In Germany, the contrast was brutal. The returning POWs stepped into a homeland in ruins. Cities flattened, food scarce, families scattered. They carried home stories that seemed almost impossible to believe. "We ate better in captivity than our families did in freedom. They gave us milk, chocolate, and even ice cream. The guards treated us like men." At first, few believed them. To people surviving on thin soup and ration cards, the idea that America had given ice cream to its enemies sounded like propaganda in reverse. But as more men returned, the accounts converged. American treatment had been consistent, humane, and strangely generous. a mirror opposite of how prisoners fared elsewhere. That realization had consequences. Many former POWs began to reevaluate everything they had been taught. The cruelty and fanaticism that had consumed Germany now seemed hollow in comparison to the quiet dignity of their captors. Some even described their years in the U.S. as the first time they had encountered genuine freedom, within fences, but free in spirit. For the Americans, the success of the POW system became a point of national pride. Congressional reports praised its efficiency. Red Cross officials cited it as a model for post-war humanitarian conduct. Newspapers ran quiet stories about towns that had grown fond of their Germans, the men who picked crops, fixed tractors, and left behind letters of thanks when they went home. In one Kansas town, a farmer's family even received a Christmas card years later, mailed from Bremen by a former prisoner. Inside it read, "I remember the bread, the laughter, and the ice cream. You taught me what decency looks like." By the war's end, the small, forgotten moments of captivity, the shared meals, the conversations, the kindness had become something greater than anyone intended. They were the beginning of reconciliation, long before peace treaties were signed, and at the center of it all remained that symbol of abundance and mercy, a bowl of ice cream served in a place built for enemies. Autumn 1946. The long return. By the end of 1946, nearly all German prisoners of war had been repatriated. Some went back through England or France for labor assignments before finally reaching their homeland. Others, deemed non-Nazi or skilled laborers, stayed longer to help with reconstruction. But wherever they went, the stories of their captivity in America spread with them like ripples on calm water. Those stories were not of hatred or revenge, but of decency, food, and human dignity. Former POWs described how American guards shared cigarettes, how camp bands played jazz and swing, how libraries were stocked with books in both German and English. And always, somewhere in their memories, there was the ice cream, cold, sweet, absurdly plentiful. To many, it became shorthand for everything they had seen and learned. A nation that could fight the most mechanized war in history and still have room for compassion. The impact of those experiences lasted far beyond the war. In the years that followed, thousands of ex-POWs wrote letters to American families, guards, and camp officers expressing gratitude for the treatment they received. Some emigrated back to the U.S. under post-war immigration programs, seeking to live in the very country that had once imprisoned them. One former soldier from Camp Trinidad, Colorado, who returned to Germany in 1946, would later tell a reporter, "They defeated us with kindness. I wanted to understand how." He would eventually become a schoolteacher in West Germany, teaching English to a generation that had never known the war. In his classroom, he sometimes told his students about the first time he tasted ice cream, and how, for a moment, he understood what freedom might feel like. These stories became part of a quiet cultural legacy, German POWs as unlikely ambassadors of the American ideal. Historians studying the POW program later recognized it as one of the most successful humanitarian efforts of the war. Unlike in Europe or Asia, where prison conditions were often brutal, the United States had managed to create a system that balanced security with civilization. Red Cross reports from 1945 confirmed that mortality among German POWs in U.S. custody was less than 1%, one of the lowest of any belligerent nation. Most deaths were from natural causes or accidents, not abuse. Even the U.S. Army's provost, Marshal General's office noted that discipline problems were minimal and manageable, attributing much of the stability to consistent food, humane treatment, and fair work policies. Behind that success lay a simple formula: an industrial superpower that used its abundance to enforce order through generosity. In Germany, as the 1950s dawned, the myth of the good captivity became a foundation for post-war reconciliation. Veterans associations published memoirs and newsletters, often recounting daily life in American camps with a mixture of nostalgia and disbelief. We had bread, butter, meat, and sometimes even dessert, one account from a Bavarian veteran read. We built gardens, sang, and learned English. It was strange. We were prisoners, yet we felt treated as men again. For a nation emerging from dictatorship, those words mattered. They helped redefine the image of the former enemy, not as conqueror, but as moral teacher. The American camps, most dismantled by 1947, left behind faint traces: concrete slabs, overgrown fences, and faded signs. But in the towns that hosted them, memories lingered. Local farmers remembered the German laborers who worked their fields and later sent letters from across the ocean. Small museums now hold the artifacts: wooden carvings, hand-drawn menus, and, in some cases, recipe books where German prisoners recorded how to make American ice cream. In these details, the story endures. The war had revealed humanity at its worst, but in these quiet corners of America, it had also revealed it at its best. By the time the last German prisoner left American soil, the U.S. had achieved something rare in war: victory without vengeance. The men who went home carried no tales of cruelty, only of discipline, fairness, and a desert that symbolized an entire nation's character. For decades after, when they spoke of the war, they often mentioned one absurd, unforgettable detail: that their first taste of peace came not on a battlefield, but in a bowl of ice cream. When the fences came down and the last of the German prisoners boarded ships for home, the camps fell silent. The watchtowers emptied, the kitchens cooled, and the smell of cooking drifted away into the wind. But for those who had lived within those boundaries, both guard and prisoner, the memory of what had happened there never faded. It wasn't the barbed wire or the labor that stayed with them. It was the civility, the small, inexplicable kindnesses: a guard who shared a cigarette, a nurse who spoke gently, a cook who handed an enemy soldier a bowl of ice cream on a sweltering afternoon. That moment, repeated in hundreds of camps across America, became something larger than an anecdote. It was the quiet proof that power and humanity could coexist. The United States, with all its might and industrial strength, had chosen not to humiliate its captives, but to show them a different kind of victory. One built on dignity, confidence, and the belief that justice didn't require cruelty. To the prisoners, it was bewildering. To the Americans, it was simply who they were. Decades later, many of those men would speak of that time not as imprisonment, but as revelation. They would recall the food, the music, the work, and the strange, unforgettable taste of ice cream in a land untouched by war. It was cold, sweet, and utterly unnecessary, which was precisely what made it powerful. In that frozen moment, an empire built on militarism met a democracy built on compassion. And for once in the long, brutal history of war, the lesson that lingered wasn't about conquest or defeat, but about the simple, disarming strength of decency. A bowl of ice cream had done what no propaganda ever could. It had made men believe in humanity again.